Hello, and welcome to Pensions in a Pod, a podcast series by Evershed Sutherland that keeps you informed on topical issues within the pensions and benefits world. I'm Jeremy Goodwin, partner and head of pensions, and in each episode within this series, we'll hear from speakers across our pensions and benefits team. And in this month's Pensions in a Pod, I'm delighted to be joined by first Tessa Page, partner and UK Wealth Strategy Lead at Mercer, whose dual role straddles working with the government on policy developments and also very much on the tools advising clients day to day. And also Simon Daniel, who heads up our pensions investment team. Now, today we're looking at the suggestion by the government that'd like to see how pension schemes can be investing more of their savings to help fuel economic growth in the UK. Now, we'll be looking at these issues in more detail at our pensions conference on the 5th of March, and I'm delighted to say Tessa will be joining us for that conversation. But wanted to really try and focus and think about that in advance of that conference. So to help us with that, I'd like to hand over to Simon.
Thanks very much, Jeremy, and thanks, Tess, for joining us. One of the things, Tess, that really stood out for me when I had a look at the interim report that was done following the Pensions Investment Review was a statement which I'm sure you also noticed near the back of the report, which said, if growth is the challenge, I think everyone recognises that growth is the challenge. But if growth is the challenge, then investment is the solution. And I think the government really means to go on to say more investment in UK productive assets by UK pension schemes is the solution. And I'm just interested to know your views on whether you think that's actually right. You know, as a principle, should UK pension schemes be doing more in order to support UK economic growth?
Yeah, so I mean, trustees and committees are not holding back investment in the UK out of some kind of spite that they just don't like the government. You know, they are very rational capital allocators who are duty bound to find the right mix of risk and return for their members within the regulatory requirements that they sit under, whether that's DB, DC, local government pension schemes. And in fact, they already support the UK by buying, you know, trillions of UK gilts. So you know, to me, I think there is a path whereby, yes, if we have investment in the UK that supports great communities and social systems that we all want to retire into, then there is a path to that. But there is no kind of amount of upheaval to the landscape that can reconcile a potential conflict between the government's understandable desire for more investment in the UK and the fiduciary duty of the decision makers that control pension funds.
I'd completely agree with that as well, Tess. I think it's really interesting the point you made about pension schemes supporting the gilt market. I mean, that is clearly the case, and what it leads me to think is whether actually part of the government's incentive or reason for encouraging surplus release and run on in DB schemes is to continue that support for the gilt market, because we know that, you know, when we have the buyout transactions happening, gilts are sold down, insurers don't really hold gilts to support their liabilities. They have different type of asset portfolio. So there's quite an interesting dynamic for government there. I think you're also right. I mean, when schemes are looking to allocate, they look at the global universe of investment opportunities, don't they? And I think, you know, you sort of look at what the government's trying to do, building up scale, consolidating. For me, what that will probably achieve more is a more globally invested set of schemes that allocate to things like infrastructure, but on a global basis. And the UK kind of benefits indirectly, but everyone else across the globe is also benefiting. Would you foresee that sort of outcome?
Yeah, so I think that's accurate. I mean, I think the best way to spark more investment in the UK would be for the government to deliver a long-term plan for economic growth that would make investment in the UK attractive, both to companies and to pension schemes. I think it's also worth saying that at the moment there are explicit barriers to investing in the UK. And, you know, we might talk about incentives, but actually removing some of the disincentives, the obvious one being stamp duty tax on UK equities. So all else being equal, it means that those rational capital allocators will need to take that into account when they're deciding on where to invest. And it is within government power to level the playing field there. One of the reasons why the Australian superannuation funds allocate more to their domestic market is there is an explicit tax advantage through franking credits. So that means that they have, there's a benefit on holding those local assets. So, let's think about the incentives rather than, just forcing or encouraging in a gentle way.
Yeah, yeah, it's got to be both sort of techniques, hasn't it? Sort of incentives and also, this sort of encouragement from policy and everything else that goes along with that. I mean, I wonder also whether there's work that the government can do, perhaps through the National Wealth Fund, to actually sort of build these opportunities, perhaps for schemes to co-invest alongside government and actually create the framework and source the actual opportunities which schemes might access, because it's difficult for schemes to find themselves, and allocating privately and directly takes a lot of effort, not just to do in the first place, but also to sort of oversee and maintain. So for me, there's a piece of work for the government to do there to incentivise or at least create and facilitate opportunities.
Yeah, and I had a great challenge actually from a professional trustee recently who said to me, "Are we looking hard enough to see if there are any attractive UK assets that we want to buy?" And at the moment we have lots and lots of pension funds all trying to navigate this. Scale will help to kind of professionalize decision making and mean that there are groups that can, properly look for these opportunities. But it needs to be supply and demand in that if there are kind of vehicles created that can help with that, then it can only be supportive of kind of getting money into to work more quickly.
Yeah. And on the theme of sort of incentives, but I guess more sort of downside protection, I know that out there in the industry currently, there is a lot of thinking being done and also representations being made to government around its plans emerging in terms of detail around relaxing the surplus release regime for ongoing DB schemes. And one of the thoughts there is that to actually make that happen to any meaningful level, i.e., to persuade trustees they should be comfortable releasing surplus, not just when they're fully funded at buyout. Perhaps the threshold for that should come down to, say, low dependency. But alongside that, if the government gets the benefit directly or indirectly through the growth effect and perhaps tax revenue, schemes would benefit from having the ability to go into the PPF for full protection.
Yeah.
I mean, do you see that as something which is feasible? Is it too disruptive?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the elephants in the room of the original Mansion House announcements was the lack of discussion on UK private sector DB actually, and we were all kind of waiting for that. And then we got a few weeks ago this, oh, there's going to be something on surplus, and then there was a little bit on surplus, but it wasn't quite specific enough on surplus to give everyone what they needed. And I mean, I think what is needed pretty quickly is clarity in the surplus rules that will empower trustees and employers to navigate this with confidence. Because at the moment, we're in a slight limbo situation in that we might get something more on surplus at some point. We don't know what that looks like, but it might make us encouraged to run on. So let's just kind of not do anything. So, I mean, something like a statutory override that would allow, that would facilitate that. But again, it'd be really helpful to have a code of practice from the regulator that might set out the, necessary protections for trustees to consider when they're thinking about this. And ultimately, we don't want to risk the security of member benefits.
It's easy to forget that sort of fundamental point in all of this, isn't it? Sort of so many interested parties looking at what's there from government to corporates, understandably, trustees sitting there thinking, well, how do we balance all of this? And ultimately,
Yeah.
it's for members. And of course, one feature of that is if you run on and you're able to use some surplus to apply discretionary pension increases or
Yeah.
allow members to
Use
benefit
it for
in some
DC.
ways,
Yeah.
there is upside for members. For DC, exactly, exactly. I think one of the things I'm aware of people saying to government is that together with looking at the surplus regime, that they should try and sort of make more consistent the way in which surplus might be used to effectively pay
For
employed
DC.
DC contributions? Because you can do it
Yeah,
within the same trust, but
exactly.
are
And
between
you know,
schemes.
it's part of that sort of disjointed system we've got, whereas where things work differently if you're in a hybrid trust versus a single DC only trust versus a master trust, a contract-based DC scheme. And you know, the UK is pretty unique in having all these little disparate systems under different regulatory regimes, that does make it harder.
Yeah, I guess the sort of maybe a tax easement if you're paying one-off lump sums to members, part of surplus sharing, as opposed to baking in sort of increased benefits for all time, could be something which is helpful. Um, Brilliant. Well, Tess, I mean, if there's one thing that you think, if government were listening to us now, in pensions in a pod, what one thing we could say to government to sort of really move the dial and sort of help our clients, the schemes we work with, what do you think that one thing might be?
I mean, I'd love to see some incentives for investment in the UK. I think that would shift the conversation. Because at the moment it's been about encouraging, you know, supporting, but actually something concrete that would really, you know, spark a broader consideration of investment in the UK. I do think, and this is probably not in the government's gift, but when I look at other systems around the world, one of the biggest differences is actually culture around retirement savings. So, you know, I've got a brother who lives in Australia, and when I went out there, they were all talking at the dinner table about their superannuation funds and how they're invested. And I said, "Oh, it's really nice of you to do this because I'm here." And they said, "No, no, we do this all the time. Like we talk about this all the time." And I just could not imagine that conversation in the UK, and actually having more saver engagement in the system, is something that I think would really change things because you know members might be interested in whether their money is invested in the UK or overseas, but at the moment we just don't have that level of kind of personal connection to pension saving.
So that's fantastic. Thanks so much. We really look forward to having you at our conference, and we'll see you there very soon.
Thank you, Simon. And of course, thank you, Tessa. That international comparison that you mentioned, Tessa, is particularly interesting. I suspect we're going to hear a lot more about the Australian pensions model in the months ahead, but I also suspect that getting there from where we are in the UK today is not going to be straightforward. I'm delighted that we'll hear more from Tessa on this and other subjects at our pensions conference on the 5th of March here at Wanwood Street. In addition to Tessa, we have economist Paul Johnson speaking about his thoughts about the development of pensions policy in the UK. And getting us started, first thing in the morning, Torsten Bell, the Pensions Minister, will be talking about his thoughts in relation to his new role. Thank you for listening to the latest episode in the Pensions in a Pod series. Stay tuned for our next edition, where we will provide more perspectives into the world of pensions and benefits.